Good evening. Nice to be back. Tonight I'm going to focus in on the Beatles. I wasn't a big Beatles fan when I was young, but my sister was, and she used to send me around all the newsagents for the latest Fab Four magazines. It wasn't until A Hard Day's Night that I developed an interest in their music, and I think it was primarily for their love songs, And I Love Her, and If I Fell. And I Love Her really took me, I remember, so much that I went back to see the film a second time just to hear the song. And but when I went back to do a bit of research on this, for this essay that I'm going to read you, it was the song If I Fell which drew my attention. And it's a very interesting song. If I fell in love with you, would you promise to be true and help me understand that I've been in love before, and I found that love was more than just holding hands? That's a terrific transition there that's going on. It's change of key, and I can see exactly where they got the idea from, because up to this, they'd been just doing, teeny bopper songs like She Loves You, Yeah, 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 and I Want to Hold Your Hands. I Want to Hold Your Hand. And suddenly, they're maturing into, and they're questioning what the whole idea of romance is about. If I give my heart to you, you must be sure from the very start that you would love me more than her. And if I love you too, oh please, don't run and hide. And if I love you too, oh please, don't hurt my pride like her. 'Cause I couldn't stand the pain, and I would be glad if our new love wasn't there. It's a fabulous melody. That, excuse my the Beatles songs are a bit out of my range, but it's a marvelous melody going on there, and especially that D9th. If I love you too, oh please, don't hurt my pride like her. 'Cause I could feel. Beautiful. What fascinated me about the song too was the fact that John and Paul had a disagreement about who wrote it later on. John maintains that he wrote it by himself, and Paul disputes that and says that he had an input into it. And John has a video, or there's a video of John singing a demo of the song, which a lot of the John fans claim is evidence that he wrote the song. But I don't see any evidence in that myself. Just the mere fact that he's singing an early version of the song, it could have been that he wrote it with Paul before he made the demo. What I find interesting about the demo is that if you listen to it carefully, that D9th isn't in it. And I can imagine maybe Paul came up with that, and maybe other elements in it. But it's a terrific song. It's probably one of their best. But anyway, we'll move on to the essay. And I'll maybe stick up this guitar. The Fab Four and the Four Evangelists. There's two headings in this one, quotations. First from Baudelaire, a French poet, kind of a decadent poet, if you like, but very bright man and very astute in many ways. And I should admit that I got the idea first, I think, from my song, The Voyage, from a poem of his called The Voyage. But his is totally different. His is about going out into the world and discovering everything is the same everywhere, and he despairs of the whole thing. But his quotation here is, "The devil's greatest ruse is to fool us into imagining that he doesn't exist." And the second quote is from John Lennon. "Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky." The two of them are related, if you want to listen back. When John Lennon defended his claim that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus by suggesting that he was merely telling things as they were at the height of the band's fame, he punctuated the explanation apology with the sharp adjunct that Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. In making this off-the-cuff remark, though he may not have realized it, Lennon pitted the Fab Four against the Four Evangelists, whose gospel stories inspired the whole of Western culture, including the development of music for 2,000 years. So where, I asked myself, when I thought of including an essay on the Beatles in this book, did this high level of hubris come from? Like most of my generations, I have a wide store of memories of the evolution of the Beatles to draw on from my appraisal of their extraordinary career, starting with the area of influence that they built their musical empire on, which had American rock and roll as its foundation. One of the undisputed kings of that realm, Jerry Lee Lewis, has acknowledged many times in interviews that in his quest for the delirium of his frenetic brand of rock and roll, he was pursued by the devil. But he wasn't the only one who flirted with old Nick in this regard. Everyone from Elvis, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, Jim Morrison, and hundreds of others came to be associated with demonic forces that fueled their careers. Sex, drugs, booze, and the bucks that fed the dissipation and debauchery was the reward for taking Route 66, and satisfaction was the destination. The very heart of black blues music had the fable of Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil in a Faustian pact to gain the skill to dazzle on his slide guitar in exchange for a short life. It's a colourful tale, and probably no more than that inspired a whole generation of guitarists around the world to jump on the bandwagon and join the mad caravan of excess. The Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, which came into late in the revolution, sums it all up, with Keith Richards' razor-sharp rhythm stabs punctuating the murder of one of their audience at a free concert in Altamont by one of a crew of Hell's Angels hired to act as security guards for a payment of $500 worth of beer. A murder that the band winged it from, it was later maliciously reported, while counting the colossal dollar takings from the rest of their US tour. Of the tamer contenders who spread the gospel of rock at its genesis, Elvis Presley and Ray Charles, one of my early singing heroes, demonstrated that even jazzed up sacred music might be used to set the party on fire. and Lennon and the Beatles were as affected by the frenzy in England as Dylan was in the States. The best things in life are free, but you can keep them for the birds and bees. I want money. That's what I want. That's what I want. Yeah, that's what I want. Money, money, money. Maybe it was coincidental, but a year after John Lennon's brash version of Berry Gordy's Paean to Greed, Money, hit the charts, Paul McCartney released a counter-upbeat message, Money can't buy you love. By this stage, the Beatles were still including cover versions of R&B, Motown and country and western on their albums. But by A Hard Day's Night, John and Paul wrote all the songs themselves, at least two of which, And I Love Her and If I Fell, showed signs of amazing melodic development. Though Lennon claimed he wrote If I Fell on his own, McCartney claims that he had an input into its complex melodic structure. And going on the skill McCartney was developing at this time, maybe he did. If he didn't, and this is crucial, for If I Fell is one of the Beatles' most amazing songs, then this may be the point in their union where the rift that would eventually poison their relationship set in. During the writing and recording of their album Beatles for Sale, it said that McCartney was so caught up in his romantic entanglement with Jane Asher, he contributed little to the record, though his song I'll Follow the Sun was deemed the best track on the album by George Martin. Looking back on it, McCartney's doomed relationship with Jane Asher was a seminal affair for the Beatles. Not only because it produced one of the most poignant love songs of all time in Yesterday, which has also become one of the biggest selling songs of pop history, despite Lennon and other Beatles vetoing releasing Paul's version as a single, an act of blatant jealousy that speaks for itself, but it also contributed to creating a similar gem in For No One, and one of the sweetest love songs ever written, Here, There and Everywhere. And if we stretch our imagination, we might also include Eleanor Rigby in McCartney's top 4 autobiographical love songs, if we think of Jilted Paul as Eleanor. And we'll sing a bit of Eleanor Rigby now, just to break the spell. This song had a powerful effect on me when I heard it back in the 60s. I think I heard it first. I was in Dublin. Oh, look at all the lonely people. Oh, look at all the lonely people. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in a church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream, waits by her window, wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by a door. Who is it for? All the lonely people. Where do they all come from? All the lonely people. Where do they all belong? Ah, look at all the lonely people. Ah, look at all the lonely people. Father Mackenzie, writing the words of his sermon that no one will hear. No one comes near, look at him working, darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. Sitting in his chair, all the lonely people. Where do they all come from? All the lonely people. Where do they all belong? Ah, look at all the lonely people. Ah, look at all the lonely people. Eleanor Rigby died in her room and was buried along with her name. Nobody came, Father Mackenzie, wiping the dirt from his hands as he walked from her grave, hoping she was saved. All the lonely people, where do they all come from? All the lonely people, where do they all belong? Indeed, where do we all belong? It's been said that Eleanor Rigby marked the end of rock and roll, and I can see why, though I completely disagree with the negative spin the critic who appraised it in this way put on it. For me, Eleanor Rigby was and still is a crucial song of our time, with its opening cry and heart-wrenching lyric, as potent and sad as anything Philip Larkin wrote during the same period, driven by a percussive string arrangement that hammered home a truth about human life at its unstable base to a generation desperately trying to avoid facing reality. But it wasn't the full story. Penny Lane, another Mccartney masterpiece, written around the same time, should have been the flip side of a double A-sided single, as it recalled a soft and wonderful side to ordinary life that our generation was at risk of forgetting existed in our frenzy to flee reality. Lennon's legion of fans, which should include the legion of Oasis fans also, Oasis being an offshoot of the brash side of Lennon's musical style, will no doubt castigate me for elevating Paul above their working class hero, but this needs to be done to put things straight. I'm not denying that Lennon was a very talented songwriter, he undoubtedly was, and without his role as the big brother checking the over-exuberant and sugary side of his siblings' personality, Paul's talents might never have blossomed the way they did, for they certainly started running to seed after he and John went their separate ways. The conflict and rivalry between John and Paul sparked off the talents of both of them and contributed to the overall success of the Beatles. But there's a lesson to be learned from the poisoned chalice of the kind of fame they enjoyed, for the acrimony and jealousy that consumed them at the height of their reign clearly demonstrate that a great price is often paid for such success. Paul's refusal to give credit to one of Lennon's finest songs, Across the Universe, was as mean-minded as Lennon's objection to releasing Paul's version of Yesterday as a single. John's song, I'm Just a Jealous Guy, was written about his romantic insecurities, born from his complex relationship with his absconded mother, but it might equally have applied to what must have been his intolerable battles to ward off the green monster that poisoned him exponentially as Paul's talents developed beside him. The venom of the diatribe, I won't call it a song, that he wrote about Paul after their breakup, How Do You Sleep, with its specific reference to the song Yesterday, was despicable and again speaks for itself. It's significant that both John and Paul lost their mothers at a young age. The fact that Paul was left with tender memories after his loss and John's were poisoned by feelings of desertion no doubt account for the difference in their temperaments. Regarding my singling John out for the role of chief offender for my purposes in this essay and this book, his guilt really was just the shared guilt of a whole generation that went off the rails in an orgy that gripped youth back in the 60s and is still gripping it today. Lennon's song Help, written in a place as bleak as Larkin's desolate attic, from the success perspective, speaks volumes about the hollowness of fame. As for Paul, he somehow always seemed to keep a level head even in his psychedelic phase. For what other rock star would have written sympathetically about a lonely parish priest as he did in his portrayal of Father Mackenzie in the middle of the swinging 60s? At a press conference set up to explain John's claim that the Beatles were more popular than Christ, after John made the valid point that had he claimed that television rather than the Beatles supplanted God in the universal imagination of the 60s, then there wouldn't have been half the furore that erupted after his unfortunate faux pas. At the same press gathering, Paul made the significant point that all the Beatles had religious upbringings behind them. Later, however, Paul too had a moment of apostasy when he pragmatically advised an obscure American songwriter, Larry Norman, who based all his songs on his Christian faith, to stop singing about God if he wanted to succeed in the music business. This next little piece is related to that. God Only Knows, for Brian Wilson. There's a growing power in the world determined to erase all mention of God from the human tongue. But there's a much more powerful force which keeps bringing the word back to human lips, and in sweeter and sweeter tones that even the godless can't refrain from singing along with, though the high-pitched octaves are out of reach to all but the pure-voiced faithful who sing from a broken heart. And now we lighten the segment with this little thing. Feet of a Dancer. F-E-A-T, by the way. James Brown did the shuffle, Chuck Berry the duck walk, but no one danced quite like Michael Jackson danced when he did the moonwalk, backsliding to Neverland, mouthing Thriller with a bunch of kids at his dancing heels, mere children at his twisted beck and call. And I leave you with this one. All the Lonely People, in memory of Brian Moore. Almost all the writers I deal with in this new work, Modern Heresies, have one thing in common. Though they mostly profess agnosticism or atheism, they built their careers to a large part on engaging with religious subjects of one kind or another, in a negative way, which makes me wonder if they didn't have that polarized position to work from, would their writing careers ever have gotten off the ground? One such writer, whom I haven't included for detailed focus in this work, though he well deserves it, is the Belfast novelist Brian Moore, who wrote extensively about religion and unbelief in novels like Catholics, Black Robe, and his masterwork, The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn, which deals with a devout Catholic spinster who lives alone with sour memories of a heartless aunt and an unrequited romantic affair that guttered early in her life. The Sacred Heart image of Christ on the mantelpiece of her shabby Belfast maisonette looks down on her misery without doing anything to alleviate her suffering. When I first read it, it gripped me with the same emotional force that the song Eleanor Rigby gripped me with when it first came over the airwaves. But what can be said about such sorrow, except that Christ experienced similar suffering, so his enthorned heart was the appropriate image to have at the center of Judith's desperate life. Come back next week, if you wish. Good night.